What is the value of Chesed in terms of the payback, or to what degree are we beneficiaries? King Solomon authored the work known as Mishlei, Proverbs. It's part of scripture. And the only way he's able to communicate spiritual concepts is by giving the equivalent example in the material. For instance, he speaks about the sweetest substance, natural substance that exists is honey. And he speaks about the sweetness of Torah. He says it's sweeter than honey. So, otherwise, unless you would give that equivalent, how do you relate to the sweetness of Torah or the pleasure of Torah when you study it properly? I once went to Rabbi Yoshev, Zechat Tzarech Livroch of blessed memory. He was the leading Torah sage in the world. And I said to him, there's a certain person who I'm encouraging to study, and he's very smart. He has a brilliant mind. But he says to me he would study, but he has no pleasure from studying. He doesn't enjoy it. And this is a man who sleeps not more than 4 hours in a 24-hour period, doesn't waste a moment. And I posed this question to him. He was already in his mid-90s. He lived till the age of 104, and he was as clear as a bell till the very end. And there was nothing which he didn't know. He says to me, it is impossible not to enjoy Torah. This person doesn't enjoy it. Why? He says, if a person has taste buds, which are functional, and you put honey on that person's tongue, does he taste sweetness? He tastes sweetness. And if not, there's a problem with his taste buds. Torah in its innately is something which is pleasurable and sweet. It is impossible that he does not enjoy it because of what it is. It's either the teacher is not an appropriate teacher, or his study partner is not the right study partner for him. But if everything would be in place, the teacher is the right teacher and the study partner is the right study partner, there's no way he can't enjoy it. Because innately, it's something which is pleasurable. There's nothing which is the equivalent of that. It's only due to distractions or not being able. Could you imagine? You have the sweetest substance and it's packaged in a piece of aluminum foil, and you remove the aluminum foil. Do you think you can taste the sweetness of that item and you're going to swallow it whole? It's not you're going to bite through the foil that you're going to have a taste of what's contained within the foil. Identically the same thing. Innately, it is that. There's nothing more pleasurable, more innately sweet than it is. But you have to ingest it. You have to imbibe it to be able to be touched by it in the right way. Chesed innately is the best investment. There's no better investment, but you don't see it. Now, there's a story, there's a tractate called Meseches Kala, the tractate of the bride. It speaks of many laws. It tells of a story, Rabbi Akiva, the great Torah sage, the greatest of the Tanoic period, who was one of the 10 martyrs, who was literally butchered by the Romans because he disseminated Torah publicly. He had a colleague, his name was Rabbi Tarfon. Rabbi Tarfon was a very wealthy man. And Rabbi Akiva knew that although he gave charity generously and magnanimously, but based on his wealth, he fell short of what he should be giving. So Rabbi Akiva wasn't going to say to him, you haven't given enough, although you're very charitable. He said to him, he says, would you like to make an investment? If you want, I have 2 very valuable properties. Would you like to buy them? 2 cities. 2 villages. Rabbi Tarfon had the money, Rabbi Tarfon, and he gives him 40,000 gold coins, which is considered a fortune. And of course, he entrusts Rabbi Akiva who's his colleague with the money. And he takes the money. What does Rabbi Akiva do with it? He distributes it to the poor, to the destitute. All 40,000 golden coins. About 6 months later, they meet. So Rabbi Tarfon says to Rabbi Akiva, how's my investment doing? How was the purchase? So he says, come with me to the base measures, to the study hall. He opens a book of Psalms, and they start reading the Psalms. And he comes to the verse in Tehillim, which David Melch says, Nosa Levionim, when you give to the destitute, Tzidkoso Miroslad, that act of righteousness remains eternally for that benefactor. That's the verse. So Rabbi Akiva says that, he says, that's your village that I purchased for you. I purchased that for you. And then all of a sudden he realized what Rabbi Akiva was saying was correct, that factually he hadn't given sufficient charity based on his financial worth. And that, what he distributed to the poor, because it says over here, David says, one who distributes his money to Evyonim. Evyon is even poorer than a poor man. He's destitute. His act of righteousness is eternal. So Rabbi Akiva says he says, didn't I built a city for you. The city's in heaven. It's not sky in the pie in the sky, as they say. Pie is in the sky, that's about it. These are edifices which are built in heaven. And when a person arrives there, you have entities which are created due to the charity that you have given, Chesed. So Reb Tarfon, when he hears this, and he realizes that Reb Akiva was correct, what he did, he kisses him on his forehead, and he says, you are my Rebbe, and you are my mentor. And he gave him a fortune of money to distribute even more money to the poor. Now, we find that when Sarah Imenu, Sarah the matriarch, passed away, Avram purchased the tomb of Machpelah on her behalf. Now, who was buried in the tomb of Machpelah? Ephron, who sold the property, didn't realize who was buried there. Adam and Eve were buried there. That was the most special burial location in the world, which we'll explain in a moment why. And it was reserved for what? For all three patriarchs and the matriarchs. And therefore, it was a secret. Because if God forbid other people would be buried there, they would desecrate the location. So therefore, Avraham was willing to pay any amount of money for that location. Now, why was it so special? Adam and Eve were buried there. God's handiwork, God's creation. The patriarchs, matriarch, Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and their spouses, who were the matriarchs, were buried there. What's so special? So the commentators explain, when a person dies, the soul departs from the body. The soul ascends. It goes to heaven. On the way up, there are all kinds of angels, accosting angels, which could actually harm that soul. Why could it harm the soul? Because since a person is not perfect in his life, although the soul hasn't yet been judged, but it's literally you're going through areas where you have all these forces which actually can harm the soul. What if you have protective armor as you go up? Then the soul is protected. It'll make it up to the heavenly throne. That'll be evaluated. What creates this insular protection, which is the equivalent of this armor that protects you from these negative forces? It's Chesed. Chesed protects you. You do Chesed, you're actually fortified with this protection. And you go, when it ascends, all the peripheries, all the surrounding forces cannot approach that soul. Of course, the soul represents Chesed. Okay? He says people who are wealthy, they have all kinds of estate planning. You leave for your children and for your this and for that. And you leave your wealth for your children, what you accomplished. So the Ahavas time says, what about for yourself? What about you should give tremendous amounts of charity before you pass away? Because that chesed will fortify yourself and it'll give you a place, a residence in the world to come. That's the equivalent of the city that Rabbi Akiva purchased on behalf of Reb Tarfon. That's what it's all about. So he gives an example. Person says, yeah, but everybody leaves money for their children. So he gives the equivalent, an allegory. A person is on trial and he's found guilty. The judge gives the convicted person the choice. Either you pay a tremendous sum to be released and not be tortured, but if you don't pay and compensate the government for what you did financially, you can be tortured to death. And he has to give the majority of his estate to the government. His kids say to him, Dad, don't you realize if you give it all away, you're leaving us with nothing? So they'll torture you to death. Better you should be tortured to death and leave us something. If children would say that to a father, what the father say? You know, if these are my children, thank you, no thank you. Ahavas Chaim writes, we're not saying you shouldn't leave something for your children, but the value to the person himself, what he needs for himself to protect himself and to establish himself in the world to come. Although he's far from perfect, we're all far from perfect. But if you have Chesed, which fortifies you, that stands in your stead. Because the people who benefited from you, those are your advocates, that as much as justice says you deserve to be punished, the good that you did, the chesed you provided for others to alleviate their pain and their lack, that will stand in your stead to protect you, that you should not be found guilty. It's the exact same thing. But I have to leave it for my kids, my children, my grandchildren. Whatever you have to leave, not saying you should leave something. And he cites a midrash, you know, there's an expression in English, charity begins at home. But it's rooted in the verse in prophets. The prophet says, "Mibsorchal tisalim." Literally, what it's referring to, that if a person has a choice to support his family or support a stranger, who has priority on that support? The family. Why? Because the Navi says, "Mibsorchal tisalim." Don't turn a blind eye on your flesh. Your family is your flesh and blood. Therefore, they are the first ones you should support. Once you've supported them sufficiently, if they need support, you support another person. Mibsorchal tisalim. So the Midrash says, Mibsorchal tisalim. Don't abandon your own flesh. You don't understand to what degree a person himself needs all that assistance to generate that chesed in his lifetime, because God forbid, after you die, that's when you really need it. And if you give it away in your lifetime and you don't give it away properly, then you've abandoned your flesh. You acted irresponsibly. Therefore, he says, good advice. Let all these whisperings, but everybody's leaving it to their families. You're going to be seen as whatever it is, as a miserly person. Only think about yourself. But if you understand what the alternative is, if you do give it away and what you have to undergo, then you're not going to do it. And your children are considered cruel and heartless, knowing if that's what's going to happen to you. But you say they don't understand, they don't appreciate it. But if you appreciate it, understand what it is, do what's in your best interest. Now, getting back to the Tum Machpelah, there's no more direct route that the soul ascends as that location. Normally, there's certain pathways that soul ascends to heaven. There are many roadblocks, there are many detours. The sooner it arrives in the world to come, it is better for the soul. There's less impediments on the way up. From the Tum Machpelah straight to the heavenly throne, it's a beeline, straight up. That's why that location is the most special burial location, because when the person's interred, that's when the soul ascends directly, without any hindrance. That's why it's so special. We don't. We go, there are many snags on the way up. We try to protect ourselves, that we shouldn't get snagged. What is the protection? Chesed, that's the protection. People, they're always saving for a rainy day. Well, that's what we need. We need a security cushion. You never know when you need that. I told over the story about the Chofetz Chaim. There was a hospital built not far from Radin, where the Chofetz Chaim lived. And you had all the wealthy people, they donated the building, the equipment, the beds, the windows. And the Chofetz Chaim was the guest speaker at the dinner, the inaugural dinner of the hospital. And the donors were there, the philanthropists who gave the money for the hospital, and there were Talmidei Chachamim there, rabbis, Torah scholars. And when the Chofetz Chaim begins speaking, he first acknowledges the presence of the Torah scholars and how special they are. And after he finishes discussing them, then he speaks like as an afterthought about the donors, the ones who gave money to build the hospital, and how important it is to have a hospital, to heal the sick, so on and so forth. So the donors were a little taken aback, almost offended. I mean, here we give all this money. It couldn't be built without our contributions. And the first one he acknowledges and praises are the Talmidei Chachamim, the Torah scholars, and the rabbis. But of course they understood. The Chofetz Chaim, if he did it, it's the right thing to do. But they tried to understand why. Why did he first acknowledge them, before the donors? So they go over to Chofetz Chaim after he speaks and says, Holy Rabbi, could you please explain why you first acknowledge the Torah scholars and not us? We gave everything. Without us, there wouldn't be a hospital. He says, I want to explain you something. In the merit of the Torah that the Torah scholars learn, people don't get sick. You don't need a hospital. But those who do get sick, you need a hospital. So you provide the secondary approach, accommodation when people get sick. So who is first and foremost? The ones who create that protective barrier. It wards off all illness and all sickness and all mishaps. If for whatever reason things fell through the cracks, that their merit wasn't sufficient, we need a hospital. Therefore, for who do I acknowledge first? The Torah scholars, the Rabbanim, and then we talk about you. But what's the concept? Chesed is very valuable, very valuable. There's nobody perfect. You want to have that in your cachet of weapons to ward off, to protect you. You need all the advocates in the world. Every time you give charity, every action creates an advocate. You could ascend with literally armies of advocates, angels, which are a representation of the acts of Chesed they did. And they surround you. It's like a king, a president has secret service. He's surrounded by them. Anybody tries to approach him, they can't approach him. Can't approach the king, can't approach the president. Hello, אני גומר שבעוד 3 דקות. כל טוב. Sorry. It's very interesting. I'll take it off recording in a second. Role models are very important in life. And especially if you're raised in an environment where the people who you were exposed to, they gave and they were sensitive to other people's needs. And when they saw the have-nots, they wanted to share what they have. to alleviate and to fill in the void which the young people didn't have. They didn't have clothing, they didn't have food, they didn't have shelter. They were so pained by it, they did whatever they can, even if they couldn't give it themselves, they would somehow arrange that that person should be accommodated. So if you brought up with certain things, it's almost natural. You have a capacity to have similar sensitivities. I'm not even talking about the genealogy that, is passed down from parent to children, which is true. Certain innate qualities a person has, it's part of our inheritance. We inherit those things. What do we gravitate to? What we stay away from? It's literally embedded, ingrained in our persona due to upbringing. Our parents raised us in a certain type of setting. But even not that. But if you could be inspired and launched by seeing other people, by seeing what value is and what you should value, what good habits are, what the return on being a good person is, rather than being a miserly person. How these people, despite giving away, they still succeed in their lives. Giving doesn't mean you have less. Sometimes just the satisfaction of make a difference in another person's life is worth more than the money that you gave to that person. Give you an example. You have a person, and this is a story, a very interesting story. Danny Thomas, the actor, the comedian. Rabbi Avram Twersky, Dr. Avram Twersky, Abraham Twersky, world-renowned psychiatrist, Hasidic pedigree, dressed like a chesed. He lived in Pittsburgh. He had a hospital for drug rehabilitation. Do you know who paid for his medical school? Danny Thomas. His father could not afford, and he was a genius. He was one of the leading students at the Torah Vodaas Yeshiva. He was a genius. He applied, they accepted him, couldn't afford the tuition. Somehow, I don't know how Danny Thomas found out about it. He says, I will underwrite his tuition. The pictures of him when he graduated, looks like a chassid. The only thing he's wearing the graduation gown and the cap and gown, but it's clear. He spoke a perfect English, no accent. He was born here in the United States. Grew up in Milwaukee. His father was a Hasidic rabbi in Milwaukee. You understand? What was the value of Danny Thomas paying for this young man's tuition to become a doctor? Do you know how many people he healed? How many people he helped? People had drug issues, drug addictions. He was world-renowned in the United States that he was able to rehabilitate these people. But when I give, I have less. When you give, you have less. Just look at the return on what you've given. A person who actually paid for Salk or Sabine, and they developed that vaccine. How many lives were saved because of that vaccine? The polio epidemic, whatever it was. But giving, I have less. Having less, of course, you have more. And you have to frame it that way. What about if you don't see it's more? He's an ordinary person. He's not going to be a Sabine. He's not going to be that special person. Doesn't make a difference. God says if you do give charity, it's such an important mitzvah. Even though you don't visually see it, ultimately, but it's a reality. You're building a base, you're building an edifice. You're building a fortress. You're building a level of protective gear which you cannot survive without it. You have armies of advocates that when you need them, they'll be there for you. So we're talking about for nothing. Just look what you've acquired, what you've achieved, what you've accomplished. And if every time you have that question, should I not, understanding what the reality of what you're doing, you do it. But let me qualify what I'm saying. I'm not telling you to act like a fool. Like somebody calls you up, I can't pay my rent. Where the person's a con man, There's no mitzvah to give that guy money. It's only a person who truly is needy. And if somebody is more needy, he's the person who should be first. He should be addressed, his need. But that's a true return. So it's not only the satisfaction, what I've done now, that I feel for the person's lack, and I want to help him, but long term, what you're going to bring in, the harvest you're going to bring in, what you don't even realize, it's all based on what you believe. And that's all mentioned in the oral law and in scripture, that's the innate value of doing chesed. So the more we discuss it, the more we elucidate it and illuminate it and give equivalent examples of what that is, it's easier that this pushback that we normally have, we overcome that pushback. Talmud tells us, how do you classify a person as a tzaddik? If the majority of his accomplishments are positive, he's a tzaddik. If the majority are negative, he's classified as Rasha. Now, the Rambam, based on the Talmud, says, just as a person is evaluated based on the majority, what about the world? The world stands in the balance. And one person does one righteous deed. He sways the balance to the right. As a result of that, the clarification of humanity is righteous due to that one person's action. He swayed the balance. See, he's accredited for the existence of the whole world. So you should always see the world in the balance, and therefore don't underestimate the value of your seemingly meaningless deed, because that meaningless good deed can actually sway the balance to the right, and you're saving the world. You know, the boy who put his finger in the dike. What did he do? He put his finger in the dike. You know what he did? Because his finger wouldn't have been in the dike, the whole community would have been inundated and destroyed. But what did he do? I could have also put my finger in the dike, but you didn't. He put it in the dike. So he's the guy who saved the day. You never know. You may be the person saving the day. So we really don't know the ramifications of any action we do. The advocacy which we create by doing that good deed could make a difference in your life, your children's lives, in all Jews' life. Because you've created an advocate, which an advocate will make a difference.